6 Genius medieval tricks that kept peasants fed year-round. In the age before supermarkets, food banks, or emergency deliveries, winter in Europe meant one thing: hunger. Not the temporary discomfort we feel today when the fridge is empty, but real, gnawing hunger. The kind that takes lives, divides families, and leaves entire villages in ruin. Yet somehow, year after year, medieval peasants survived. They endured famine, war, blight, and the coldest winters without technology, supply chains, or backup plans. How? Because they mastered not just single techniques, but entire systems. Ingenious, resourceful, and shockingly effective tricks that kept them fed from harvest to harvest. Tricks so clever that even modern preppers, with all their gadgets, could stand to learn a thing or two. Here are 6 genius medieval tricks that kept peasants fed year-round, and might just save you too. 1. The living pantry, hedgerows that feed and defend. Imagine walking along the edge of a medieval village. Instead of barbed wire or wooden fences, you find dense, woven walls of hawthorn, blackthorn, wild roses, and hazelnut. These are not just barriers. They are living pantries, a system called hedge laying. For most of us today, a fence is simply a fence. But for medieval peasants, hedgerows were a vital, multi-purpose resource. Every spring and autumn, the villagers would maintain these green walls, partially cutting and weaving young saplings, so they grew horizontally and thickened into impenetrable barricades. But this wasn't just about keeping out wolves or thieves. The selection of plants was deliberate. Blackthorn for its fierce thorns and edible sloes, hazel for its nuts, brambles for berries, and elder for medicine. Hidden among the thorns, peasants found wild apples, plums, and herbs, an edible barrier that supplied food well after harvest. Come late summer, children and elders combed the hedges, collecting baskets of fruit and nuts. In lean years, these living fences fed whole families. In winter, they supplied dried berries and the last of the stored hazelnuts. Even the yearly trimmings had value: firewood, basketry, animal fodder, and natural medicine. Modern preppers often overlook the edge of their property, spending thousands on fences that rot or rust. But the medieval hedge was a system: food, medicine, fuel, and defense in one. In a world suddenly without plastic or metal, could you turn your boundaries into abundance? 2. Earth's cold embrace. Underground storage and root cellars. No refrigerators, no freezers, no electricity. How did medieval people keep food from spoiling, especially through long, wet winters? The answer lay beneath their feet. All across Europe, peasants dug root cellars and underground pits. There, sometimes nothing more than a simple hole lined with straw, sometimes elaborate, stone-lined chambers beneath cottages and barns. The principle was simple, but powerful. Earth stays cool and damp year-round, creating the perfect conditions for preserving food. In autumn, families stored turnips, carrots, beets, parsnips, cabbages, and potatoes, buried in layers of straw or sand to regulate moisture and prevent rot. Apples were carefully stacked, with each fruit wrapped in a dry leaf to prevent the spread of mold. Grains, beans, and dried peas found their place in sealed clay jars, safe from rodents and humidity. But it wasn't just about digging a hole. Placement mattered. Not too close to a river to avoid flooding, not too far from the house for easy access during blizzards. Airflow was managed with ventilation pipes, simple reeds or hollowed branches that prevented mildew. In the coldest regions, Extra insulation was achieved by piling earth and manure over the cellar's roof. Even in the bleakest months, a well-stocked root cellar was a lifeline, turning the earth itself into a giant, natural refrigerator. Modern off-gridders are rediscovering this lost wisdom. But for medieval peasants, it was second nature. Plan ahead, dig deep, and let nature do the work. 3. The art of stretching, soups, stews, and perpetual broth. Step into a medieval peasant's kitchen on a cold evening. At the center, a battered iron cauldron hangs over the fire, always simmering, rarely empty. This was the perpetual stew, a culinary tradition that stretched scraps into sustenance and turned scarcity into abundance. The method was elegant in its simplicity. Each day, whatever was available, bones, vegetables, grains, herbs, even wild greens, was added to the pot. The broth was replenished with water, and leftovers were simply boiled again and again. In some households, the stew would bubble for weeks on end, gaining complexity with each addition. Why was this so effective? First, boiling preserved and extracted every possible nutrient. Bones yielded minerals and collagen. Tough roots became tender and digestible. Even wilted greens provided vital vitamins. Second, nothing was wasted. Last night's stale bread? Toss it in. The final bits of dried meat? In they go. Each meal became a living, evolving dish, unique to the season, the region, and the family's fortunes. Medieval chroniclers describe stews flavored with wild garlic, nettles, onions, barley, beans, and sometimes a lucky piece of bacon or sausage. For children, the promise of a good bit in the bottom of the pot turned dinner into a daily adventure. Modern survivalists praise the one-pot meal for its efficiency, but the medieval perpetual stew was more. It was a daily act of resilience, community, and ingenuity. In a crisis, could you turn scraps into survival and boredom into comfort? 4. Preservation without power, smoking, drying, and fermenting. It's hard to imagine life without a fridge or freezer. For medieval peasants, every harvest brought the same challenge: how to make food last until spring. Their solution? Mastery of preservation techniques that modern kitchens have all but forgotten. Smoking. Most think of smoked meat or fish as a luxury, but in the Middle Ages, it was a necessity. Every village had its smokehouse, sometimes nothing more than a lean-to with a smoldering fire. Meat, sausages, and even cheese hung from beams for days, absorbing smoke from juniper, beech, or oak. The process not only flavored the food, but infused it with compounds that deterred bacteria and insects. Smoked grains and beans stored in bags, hung near the smoke, absorbed similar protections, keeping weevils at bay. Drying. On sunny days, women and children spread thin slices of apples, plums, and pears on racks above the hearth or outside on clean linens. Herbs and wild mushrooms were strung up to air dry. Fish and strips of game were laid out in the breeze, away from scavengers, until they were hard as wood. Fermentation. Long before probiotics were trendy, medieval peasants fermented cabbage into sauerkraut, turnips into tangy pickles, and milk into thick, sour cheese. The secret? Salt and thyme. In stoneware crocks, salt drew out water, suppressing harmful bacteria while letting beneficial microbes transform and preserve the food. Vinegar, another medieval staple, was used to pickle beets, onions, and even eggs. Preserved food meant survival. not just calories, but vital vitamins to stave off scurvy and illness. In years of plenty, cellars filled with jars, bags, and crocks. In lean years, they ran low, and every morsel was rationed. Today, artisanal foodies celebrate these traditions. But for medieval peasants, it was the difference between life and death. 5. The wild larder, mastering foraging and seasonal rotation. Every spring, as snow melted and fields lay bare, medieval peasants ventured beyond their gardens in search of wild food. Foraging was not a hobby. It was a necessity, a skill as vital as plowing or weaving. The landscape was their larder. 6. Communal cooking, the power of shared ovens and hearths. If you imagine every medieval family hunched over their own fire, think again. Across villages and towns, communal cooking was the rule, not the exception. Shared ovens, common hearths, and collective meals defined rural life, not just for efficiency, but for survival. The medieval survival system. A lost blueprint for modern resilience. Looking back, it's easy to romanticize the ingenuity of the past. But none of these tricks were magic. They were born from necessity, hardship, and endless trial and error. Yet, what set medieval peasants apart was not just what they did, but how they thought. They built systems, not gadgets. Every technique, hedgerows, root cellars, foraging, perpetual stew, communal ovens, was part of a larger, integrated approach to survival. Food, medicine, defense, and community were woven together into a fabric of daily life. Nothing was wasted, everything was shared, and every challenge was met with cooperation as well as skill. Which of these medieval tricks would you try first? Drop your thoughts and questions below. Because the greatest lesson of all may be this: survival isn't about going it alone. It's about reviving the systems that once made us resilient, together.